The heavy oak doors of the bedchamber swung open, the iron hinges groaning against the cold stone walls. Alpha King Torin stepped over the threshold, his broad shoulders filling the frame. His face set in a mask of calculated indifference. He had come to do exactly what Vesper knew he would do. He had come to reject her, to tell her that a weak, floral-scented Omega had no place on the throne beside him, to discard their mate bond before the mating ceremony even began. His cedar and pine scent rolled into the room, thick and commanding, laced with the arrogant certainty of a monarch about to crush a fragile thing. Vesper stood silently by the open window, the freezing autumn rain lashing against her pale skin. She did not tremble. She did not weep. She merely turned her head to look at him, her dark eyes devoid of the desperate devotion that used to amuse him so much in their past life. Torin stopped halfway across the thick Persian rug, his brow furrowed, his magnificent chest expanded as he drew in a deep breath, preparing to deliver the words that would sever their souls. He inhaled, and he inhaled nothing. The arrogant sneer melted from his sculpted features, replaced instantly by a twitch of profound confusion. He breathed in again, deeper this time, his nostrils flaring wide. There was only the smell of rain, damp stone, and the faint, bitter trace of burnt ash. The soft, sweet floral scent of his fated mate, the scent he had so bitterly complained about, the scent that anchored his wolf to sanity, was entirely gone. A violent shudder ripped through Torin's massive frame. The sensory deprivation hit his inner wolf like a physical blow to the skull. His cedar scent immediately soured, twisting into the rancid, metallic stench of sheer terror. He stumbled backward, his boots tangling in the rug. A low, ragged wheeze escaped his lips. The king fell hard against the stone archway, his hands flying to his own throat. He tore at his collar, his sharp claws drawing blood against his own neck as he desperately gasped for air that felt suddenly empty. He was suffocating in a room full of oxygen, his mind fracturing because his soul could no longer find hers. Vesper watched his chest heave, listening to the pathetic, wet sounds of his hyperventilation. The agonizing baths of diluted Wolfsbane and ash had done their job. She was a ghost. She picked up her simple leather travel bag, her steps completely silent as she walked toward the door. Torin reached a shaking, bloodied hand toward her boot, his golden eyes wide with a primal, agonizing panic. He could see her, but his wolf screamed that she was already dead. Vesper stepped over his writhing body without a single backward glance, slipping out into the endless, freezing rain. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. The freezing rain felt like salvation. I plunged into the dense treeline, my leather boots slipping on the slick, rotting leaves, but I did not slow my pace. The jagged branches of the ancient pines tore at my cloak, their sharp wooden fingers clawing at my hood. Yet I felt nothing but the intoxicating rush of absolute freedom. In my veins, the toxic residue of diluted Wolfsbane pulsed like liquid ice. It had burned my skin raw for 7 agonizing days, turning my bathwater black with ash and my own blood, but tonight, it made me invincible. I was a ghost moving through the graveyard of my past, leaving no trace, no scent, no shadow for the Alpha King to hunt. A sudden clap of thunder rolled across the blackened sky. The sound hit my chest, vibrating through my ribs, and in a terrifying instant, the dark forest vanished. The sensory echo of my past life violently seized my mind. I was no longer running through the rain. I was standing in the center of the high council chamber, the polished marble floor freezing against my bare feet. The air in the room was suffocating, thick with the overpowering, aggressive pheromones of the kingdom's elite alphas. And there, seated upon the obsidian throne, was Torin. His golden eyes, which had once promised me the world, were narrowed in cold, calculating disgust. He leaned forward, his massive hands gripping the armrests of his throne, his gaze raking over me, as if I were a diseased animal that had wandered into his pristine hall. The council members whispered. Their voices were like the hissing of venomous snakes, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. A pathetic Omegan runt. A liability. How could a king command respect with a mate who smells of fragile jasmine and sweet honeysuckle? The words tore at my soul, but it was Torin's silence that truly broke me. He did not defend me. He did not claim me. He simply absorbed their disgust and made it his own. He stepped down from the dais. His heavy boots echoed like a death knell in the cavernous room. When he stopped before me, his magnificent chest rose and fell, radiating a suffocating heat. He leaned close, his mouth hovering just inches from my ear. The memory of his voice still scraped against the inside of my skull. Soft things do not survive in a world of teeth and claws. You embarrass me. Your scent makes me weak. A king cannot afford to be weak. I remembered the agonizing crack of my heart breaking. I remembered falling to my knees, choking on my own tears. begging the mate bond to remind him of our destined connection. But he simply turned his broad back to me. From the shadows of the pillars, a tall, battle-scarred beta female stepped forward. Her scent was sharp, acidic, smelling of rusted iron and crushed pine. Torin took her hand. He presented her to the council as his chosen queen, discarding me like a withered petal. The violent severing of our bond in that past life had triggered a physical hemorrhage within my chest. I remembered the metallic taste of blood filling my mouth, the agonizing darkness pulling me under as I died on the cold marble floor, entirely alone, discarded and unloved. The wet slap of a pine branch against my cheek snapped me out of the nightmare. I stumbled forward, my lungs burning, the rain washing away the phantom taste of blood. I was alive. The goddess had spun the wheel of fate backward, pulling me from the grip of death and dropping me into my own bedchamber exactly 1 week before the mating ceremony. 1 week to change my destiny. 1 week to ensure I would never be humiliated again. I had dragged myself out of bed that first morning, still feeling the phantom pain of my shattered heart, and walked straight into the castle's apothecary. I stole every bundle of dried wolfsbane I could carry. It was a lethal poison to our kind, a neurotoxin meant to paralyze and kill. But I did not want to die. I wanted to burn. I filled my copper bathtub with scalding water, crushing the purple flowers into the basin, mixing in the cold, gray ash from the hearth. Stepping into that bath was like lowering myself into a pit of liquid fire. The poison attacked my nervous system immediately, stripping the fragile jasmine and honeysuckle pheromones from my skin, boiling away my biological identity. Every day, the pain lessened as my biology forcefully adapted to the toxin. By the 7th night, my skin was pale, my veins tracked with faint silver lines, and my scent was completely, permanently eradicated. I had become chemically invisible. I slowed my running down to a steady walk as the dense forest gave way to a clearing. The kingdom's northern border was just ahead. 3 massive sentry wolves paced back and forth along the jagged ridge, their glowing yellow eyes scanning the darkness, their noses to the wind. Normally, an Omega attempting to cross the border would trigger a frenzied alarm. Their powerful senses would detect the sweet, panicked scent from miles away. I did not hide. I did not crouch. I walked straight out of the treeline and across the open, moonlit snow. The sentries stopped. They looked around, their ears twitching at the faint crunch of my boots. But as they drew in deep breaths of the night air, their expressions remained completely blank. Their eyes slid right past me. To their primal senses, the space I occupied was utterly empty. I was standing mere feet from them, but I did not exist. A cold, victorious smile touched the corners of my lips. My biological cloaking was absolute. I slipped past the sentries, stepping onto the neutral territory beyond the border. I was finally free, but just as the tension began to drain from my stiff shoulders, a sound ripped through the night. It was not a normal howl. It was a horrific, blood-curdling scream of pure, animalistic agony, echoing all the way from the high towers of the castle miles behind me. The sound physically shook the trees around me. It was the sound of a king's wolf shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Torin had realized the truth, and the hunt had begun. The echo of Torin's agonizing scream faded into the endless dark of the northern woods. I did not stop walking. I did not turn around to look at the towering black spires of the castle that had been my prison across 2 lifetimes. The mate bond, that invisible, celestial thread meant to bind our souls for eternity, hung severed and dead in my chest. It felt like a phantom limb, a hollow, aching cavity where a beating heart should have been. But I welcomed the emptiness. The emptiness was safe. For days, I moved like a phantom through the jagged mountains and frozen valleys of the neutral territories. The wilderness was brutal, unforgiving, a frozen wasteland that tested the limits of my physical endurance. But I was no longer the fragile, honeysuckle-scented Omega who wept at the harshness of the world. The diluted wolfsbane and ash had burned away my vulnerability, leaving behind something hardened and cold. The snow fell in thick, heavy sheets, burying my tracks the moment I lifted my boots. I had no destination in mind, only the overwhelming drive to put as much distance between myself and the Alpha King as possible. My survival depended entirely on my newfound biological cloaking. I realized the true extent of my gift on the 4th night of my journey. I had stumbled into a deep ravine, seeking shelter from a biting blizzard, only to find myself standing in the center of a rogue encampment. There were 6 of them. Massive, feral wolves with matted fur and glowing, bloodshot eyes. They were huddled around a meager fire, their sharp noses twitching constantly, scanning the wind for prey or intruders. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. In my past life, This would have been a death sentence. My sweet, floral scent would have driven them into a frenzy of violence and hunger. I waited for them to turn. I waited for the snarls, the bared teeth, the inevitable attack. But nothing happened. I stood less than 20 paces away. The wind shifted, blowing directly from me toward their camp. One of the largest rogues lifted his massive head, sniffing the air aggressively. His yellow eyes scanned the darkness, sweeping right past my shivering form. He grunted, shook his massive head, and lay back down in the snow. I was nothing to them. I was the wind. I was the falling snow. I was an empty void in their primal landscape. A strange, dark thrill rushed through my veins. The agonizing week of bathing in liquid fire had rewired my biology completely. By systematically destroying my pheromones with the toxic neurotoxin, I had erased my presence from the wolf hierarchy. I possessed the ultimate power of absolute invisibility. I could walk among monsters and remain completely untouched. I backed away slowly, my steps light and silent, leaving the rogues to their miserable fire. As the days turned into weeks, I continued my journey eastward, toward the distant, independent mountain villages where the authority of the Alpha Kings held no sway. The harsh environment demanded a terrifying toll on my body, yet I found myself thriving in the extreme isolation. My body, saturated with the residual resistance to the Wolfsbane, exhibited another miraculous adaptation. I discovered this second gift while foraging in the deep, overgrown valleys known as the Weeping Basin. The basin was notorious, a perilous stretch of land completely blanketed in a dense, low-hanging fog composed entirely of naturally occurring nightshade and wild, concentrated wolfsbane spores. It was a graveyard for our kind. The bones of wolves who had wandered too close littered the basin floor, their nervous systems paralyzed by the toxic air before they even realized they were suffocating. I needed to cross the basin to reach the mountain pass. There was no other way around. Standing at the edge of the toxic fog, I took a deep breath. The memory of the copper bathtub, the black water, and the searing pain flared in my mind. I had already survived the worst. I stepped into the gray mist. The air was incredibly thick, tasting of bitter almonds and rot. My lungs expanded, drawing the concentrated spores directly into my bloodstream. I waited for the paralysis. I waited for the terrifying numbness to creep up my limbs, for my throat to close, for my heart to stutter and fail. Instead, my heart beat strong and steady. The faint silver lines beneath my pale skin pulsed slightly, neutralizing the atmospheric poison instantly. My biology recognized the toxin not as a threat, but as an old, conquered enemy. I walked through the valley of death with the casual ease of a woman strolling through a summer garden. I stepped over the bleached skulls of massive alphas and cunning betas, realizing with a chilling certainty that the very substance that was meant to be the ultimate weapon against my species was entirely harmless to me. I was immune. I emerged on the other side of the Weeping Basin as the dawn broke over the jagged mountain peaks. The air was clear and freezing, the sky painted in bruised shades of purple and gold. I found a small, icy stream and washed the toxic dust from my face. I looked at my reflection in the dark, rushing water. My eyes, once warm and desperately seeking approval, were now bottomless and cold. My soft features had sharpened, carved by survival and indifference. I had become an entirely new apex predator, not through sheer physical strength, nor through the commanding roar of an alpha, but through the terrifying power of absence and immunity. Torin wanted a strong mate. He wanted a queen who could not be broken. He had discarded me because I was soft. Now, I was something far more dangerous. I was a ghost coated in poison, walking a path where no one could ever reach me again. I climbed the final ridge, the sprawling, peaceful expanse of a hidden mountain village coming into view below. Smoke curled from stone chimneys. The distant sound of chopping would echoed in the crisp air. I would build my life here. A quiet, invisible life. A sharp snap of a heavy pine branch echoed directly behind me. The sound was too heavy for an animal, too deliberate for the wind. I did not flinch. I simply closed my eyes, the freezing air whispering past my ears, as a massive shadow suddenly fell over my boots. The harsh chill of the stone floor seeped into Torin's cheek, pulling him up from the suffocating blackness. He gasped, his massive chest heaving, as if he had just been dragged from the bottom of a frozen lake. His fingers curled inward, his sharp claws scraping desperately against the unforgiving stone as he tried to anchor himself to reality. His throat burned. It felt raw, torn from the inside out, tasting of copper and bile. He pushed himself onto his hands and knees, his head hanging heavily between his trembling shoulders. The silence in the bedchamber was absolute. It was a heavy, dead silence that pressed against his eardrums until they throbbed. He forced his golden eyes open, the dim moonlight casting long, distorted shadows across the empty room. It was Vesper's room. He knew this. His mind possessed the logical coordinates of his own castle. But his inner wolf, the primal, instinctual soul that guided his every breath as an alpha king, was entirely blind. He inhaled sharply, his nostrils flaring. Nothing. He dragged another breath deep into his lungs, panic beginning to vibrate through his muscles. The air was dead. It held the faint trace of damp stone, the metallic tang of his own blood where he had clawed his neck, and a lingering, bitter dust that smelled faintly of burnt ash. But the sweet, delicate fragrance of jasmine and honeysuckle was missing. It was not just faint. It was not just masked. It was eradicated from the very fabric of the atmosphere. A low, guttural whine ripped its way out of Torin's throat, a sound so pitiful and broken it did not belong to a king. The mate bond, the celestial tether that was supposed to snap firmly into place the moment he crossed her threshold tonight, was a gaping, bleeding void in his chest. He clutched his heart, his heavy fingers digging into his own chest muscles. The agony was unimaginable. It felt as though an invisible hand had reached through his ribcage and violently ripped out a vital organ. Where is she? The thought was not a question. It was a frantic, terrifying demand from his wolf. Torin staggered to his feet, his massive frame swaying precariously. He crashed into the heavy oak dressing table, sending glass vials and wooden brushes clattering to the floor. He ignored the mess, his golden eyes wide and unfocused as he tore the heavy curtains away from the window. The freezing autumn rain lashed against his face, but he felt only the horrifying numbness spreading through his veins. His cedar and pine scent, usually so rich, commanding, and unshakable, began to curdle. The deep, woody aroma soured rapidly, turning sharp and acidic, filling the room with the rancid, metallic stench of sheer terror. An alpha's scent was his identity, his emotional baseline. For an alpha king to smell of pure, unadulterated fear was an impossibility. Yet, he was drowning in it. He turned wildly, tearing the thick quilts from the bed. Empty. He ripped the heavy wooden doors of her wardrobe off their iron hinges, tossing them aside like kindling. Empty. He fell to his hands and knees, crawling across the Persian rug like a desperate beast, pressing his nose directly into the fabric, begging the goddess for a single, microscopic trace of her floral warmth. There was only the scent of ash. The hollow cavity in his chest throbbed with a sickening rhythm. He remembered the arrogant sneer he had worn when he pushed her doors open hours ago. He remembered feeling so superior, so detached from the celestial magic that bound them. He had believed that his sheer willpower could override fate, that he could carve out a destiny devoid of the soft, gentle anchor the goddess had designed for him. How incredibly foolish he had been. The moment the connection vanished, the moment he inhaled that terrifying blankness, every wall of his ego had vaporized. He was not a god. He was an animal who had just lost its heart. A terrifying realization began to settle over his fractured mind. The sweet, fragile Omega he had intended to mock. The woman whose soft scent he had found so deeply embarrassing. The mate he had walked into this very room to brutally reject, was completely gone. And without her, his strength meant absolutely nothing. He burst out of the bedchamber, his agonizing roar shaking the stone foundations of the ancient corridor. Guards stationed at the end of the hall drew their weapons in alarm, their eyes widening in absolute horror as they saw their king. Torin did not look like a sovereign. He looked like a feral monster, his eyes glowing a manic, unstable gold, his mouth locked in a permanent snarl of agony. Find her. His voice was a demonic, jagged command that forced the guards to their knees. The royal castle erupted into absolute chaos. Torin moved like a hurricane of destruction, tearing through the grand halls, smashing through locked doors, upending heavy dining tables, and shattering centuries-old tapestries. He hunted through the lower dungeons and the highest towers, his desperate calls echoing through the rain-swept night. He demanded answers from his terrified betas, shaking his most trusted advisors by their collars, his mind entirely incapable of processing their panicked apologies. No one had seen her. No one had smelled her. She had vanished from a heavily fortified castle, without triggering a single alarm, without leaving a single trail for the most elite trackers in the kingdom to follow. Hours bled into the cold, gray light of dawn. The castle was in ruins, a physical manifestation of the king's shattered mind. Torin stood alone in the grand courtyard, the relentless rain soaking through his ruined clothes, plastering his dark hair to his forehead. His breathing was ragged, shallow, and fast. His chest continued to spasm with relentless, hollow ache. His kingdom, his power, his crown, everything he had valued above his fated mate, now felt utterly meaningless. He was a king of ash and dust. Slowly, his trembling gaze dropped to the ground near the grand iron gates. The rain had washed away almost everything, but tucked beneath the heavy shadow of the stone archway, protected from the downpour, was a single footprint. He dropped heavily to his knees, ignoring the sharp gravel biting into his skin. He leaned down, his face inches from the mud. It was the imprint of a small leather boot. He inhaled deeply, praying for a sign, a direction, a sliver of hope. The footprint smelled of nothing but cold, dead ash. A fresh wave of suffocating darkness washed over him. She was truly a ghost. And he was completely, utterly alone. 6 months drifted by like the slow, silent accumulation of snowfall. I built my life in the hidden mountain village of Oakhaven, far beyond the reach of the Alpha Kings and their archaic laws. The villagers were a mix of rogue wolves who had abandoned their oppressive packs and ordinary humans who simply wanted to be left alone to survive. They did not care who I was, or where I came from, or why I possessed no scent. To them I was simply Vesper, the quiet woman, who lived in the small stone cottage at the edge of the creeping woods. I chopped my own firewood until my hands blistered and calloused. I hunted my own meals, setting traps in the deep snow. I slept beneath thick, heavy woolen blankets, without the terrifying fear of waking up to a sneering counsel or a husband who despised the very air I breathed. My heart, which had once been a fragile, weeping thing, completely hardened into a beautiful, impenetrable diamond. I felt absolutely nothing for the past. I felt nothing for the arrogant mate I had left writhing on the floor of my old bedchamber. Rumors occasionally bled into our isolated sanctuary, carried by traveling merchants who braved the treacherous mountain passes to sell their wares. They sat by the hearth in the village tavern nursing warm mugs of spiced ale, and spoke of the southern kingdom falling into absolute ruin. They whispered terrifying wide-eyed tales of Alpha King Torin. The once magnificent and composed ruler had become a feral, unpredictable shadow of a man. They said he had entirely abandoned his throne, leaving his greedy council to squabble over the remnants of his power while he tore across the continent like a starving rabid beast. He was hunting a ghost. He was systematically slaughtering aggressive rogue packs, overturning neutral territories, and violently violating ancient peace treaties, all in a desperate, maddening search for a scentless woman. The merchants described his golden eyes as hollow, glowing with a manic, terrifying instability. They swore his scent, once a commanding rich cedar, had permanently soured into the rancid metallic stench of burnt ash and unending terror. He was dying from the inside out, his inner wolf cannibalizing its own mind, because the sacred mate bond had been unnaturally severed. I listened to these stories while purchasing winter root vegetables in the busy village square. I did not flinch. I did not smile. I did not offer a single word of pity. I simply handed the merchant my copper coins, picked up my basket, and walked away. Torin was reaping exactly what he had sown in blood and tears. He had demanded a strong, unbreakable queen in our past life, and discarded me because my softness disgusted his royal sensibilities. Now my absolute absence was destroying him far more effectively than any invading army ever could. The winter solstice arrived, bringing with it a biting, freezing wind that drove most of the villagers indoors. I wrapped my thick fur cloak tightly around my shoulders, stepping out into the blinding white snow to gather final supplies from the market before the impending blizzard hit. The village square was sparsely populated. A few vendors huddled over small iron braziers, rubbing their gloved hands together to ward off the frostbite. I moved quietly among them, my heavy boots making soft, rhythmic crunching sounds against the packed ice. My biological cloaking remained absolute. I was a void in the sensory landscape, an empty space moving gracefully through the freezing air. I stopped at the local butcher's stall, leaning forward to inspect a fresh cut of venison. A sudden, unnatural stillness fell over the market. It was not the peaceful silence of the falling snow. It was a suffocating, terrifying quiet that happens when an apex predator enters a fragile territory. The vendor in front of me dropped his carving knife, his eyes widening in absolute horror as he stared fixedly past my shoulder. I could feel the sudden violent spike of fear pheromones flooding the freezing air around me. The townsfolk were shrinking back, pressing themselves against the wooden stalls, desperately trying to make themselves small and invisible. The wind shifted violently. A heavy, crushing scent slammed into my senses. It was cedar and pine, but heavily corrupted, choking with the rancid, bitter smell of panic, exhaustion, and burnt ash. It was a scent that carried the crushing weight of a shattered kingdom and a fractured mind. My pulse remained incredibly steady. I did not turn around immediately. I calmly placed the venison into my leather satchel, ignoring the terrified shaking of the butcher. I knew exactly who was standing behind me. The heavy, uneven crunch of boots against the snow approached, stopping mere inches from my back. The sheer physical heat radiating from him was staggering, fighting a desperate war against the freezing blizzard. I could hear his ragged, shallow breathing. It sounded like a man who had forgotten how to take a full lungful of air months ago. Vesper. The voice was completely unrecognizable. It was not the arrogant, booming command of an alpha king dictating laws to a submissive council. It was a ruined, desperate scrape of sound, a pathetic, broken whisper that barely survived the howling wind. The sound of his voice carried 1,000 unspoken, agonizing pleas. It carried the desperate, crawling need of a man who had spent 6 grueling months drowning in an ocean of sensory deprivation and had finally found a fragile piece of driftwood. I turned around slowly, my expression completely blank. Torin stood before me. The sight of him was deeply jarring. The magnificent sculpted king who had sneered at me in the high council chamber was gone. His dark hair was overgrown and matted with snow and dried blood from careless battles. His golden eyes were severely sunken, surrounded by dark, bruised skin, wide and manic with a terrifying, fragile hope. His clothes, once pristine royal leathers, were torn and filthy, hanging off a frame that had lost significant muscle mass. He was trembling violently, not from the freezing mountain cold, but from the sheer, overwhelming psychological shock of seeing me in the flesh. He reached out a massive, shaking hand, his long, lethal claws carefully retracted. His fingers hovered agonizingly close to the edge of my fur cloak, terrified to make contact. Terrified that if he touched me, I would shatter into ash and vanish into the wind once again. He inhaled desperately, his chest expanding, as he tried to pull my scent into his starving lungs. He found only the same terrifying blankness, the same toxic absence that had triggered his collapse on the night of the ceremony. His chest heaved a localized, violent tremor, racking his massive shoulders. He opened his cracked mouth to speak, but no words came out. Only a pathetic, quiet whine that shattered the frozen silence of the village square. I looked up at him. I did not see a powerful king. I did not see my fated mate. I saw a broken stranger standing in my way. The freezing mountain wind howled through the village square, carrying with it the thick, blinding white snow of the incoming blizzard. It swirled around us, a violent, chaotic dance that perfectly mirrored the shattered, fractured state of the man standing before me. Torin, the Alpha King, the ruler of the Southern Territories, the mate who had callously discarded me to secure his own political power, was standing in the dirty, packed snow of a rogue village market. He looked like a corpse that had clawed its way out of a frozen grave. His breath came in ragged, pathetic hitches, forming small white clouds in the frigid air between us. He was staring at me. His golden eyes were blown wide, the pupils dilated with a manic, desperate terror. He was searching my face, scanning every inch of my features for a flicker of recognition, for a single spark of the desperate, agonizing love I used to carry for him like a terminal disease. He was waiting for the explosion. I could see the anticipation bracing his ruined shoulders. He expected me to scream. He expected me to drop my basket, to hurl curses at him, to beat my fists against his massive chest, and demand to know how he dared to track me down. He was preparing to absorb my hatred, because hatred was still a connection. Hatred meant there was still a fire burning beneath the ice. Hatred meant the mate bond, though severely damaged, still existed in some mutated, agonizing form. He wanted my anger because my anger would prove that he still mattered. I gave him nothing. I simply looked at him. I did not blink. I did not frown. My resting heart rate did not elevate by a single beat. I studied the hollow, sunken planes of his cheeks, the dark, exhausted bruising beneath his eyes, and the filth matting his overgrown dark hair. I felt completely, perfectly empty. The agonizing baths of diluted Wolfsbane and ash had not only burned away my soft floral scent, but they had also cauterized the bleeding, emotional wounds of my past life. I was a fortress of absolute, pristine ice. His aggressive, suffocating scent of rancid cedar and burnt panic washed over me, but it could not penetrate the walls of my biological cloaking. I was untouchable. Are you lost? My voice cut through the howling wind. It was completely flat. It held no malice, no bitterness, no sorrow, and absolutely no affection. It was the detached, polite tone one might use to address a wandering traveler who had taken a wrong turn at the crossroads. It was the voice of a stranger speaking to another stranger. The question hit him with the force of a physical blow. A violent, full-body shudder ripped through his massive frame. He flinched as if I had driven a silver blade directly into his gut. His mouth opened, a choked, pathetic sound escaping his throat as he struggled to process the sheer, terrifying weight of my apathy. "Vesper, please." He gasped the words, stumbling forward a single agonizing step. His heavy boots crushed the ice beneath him. "Please. I have looked everywhere. The castle, the borders, the neutral lands. I could not find your scent. I could not feel you. It is gone. Everything is gone." He reached for me again. His large, trembling hand extended toward the thick fur collar of my winter cloak. His long, sharp claws were meticulously retracted, pulled back into his nail beds so he would not accidentally scratch me. It was a gesture of supreme submission, a pathetic attempt to prove he was no longer the arrogant monster who had sneered at my softness in the High Council chamber. I took a half step backward, adjusting the leather strap of my satchel over my shoulder. I did not move out of fear. I moved out of a calm, polite desire for personal space. Do not touch me. The command was quiet. It did not boom with the authoritative echo of an alpha. It did not tremble with the desperate fear of an omega. It was simply a fact, a cold, immovable boundary drawn in the snow between us. Torin froze instantly. His hand hovered in the empty, freezing air suspended between us like a broken promise. The sudden, violent rejection of his physical presence triggered a catastrophic reaction within his already fractured mind. His golden eyes filled with hot, pooling tears that immediately began to freeze on his dirt-streaked cheek.
Welcome back to our channel. Today, Mott V brought you a brand new and incredibly captivating story, sure to please you if we watch the whole video. This story is entirely fictional. The video was created using artificial intelligence AI and is designed to provide positive entertainment and educational value to viewers aged Muiba and up. Now let us continue exploring today's story.
He was vibrating now, a rapid, uncontrollable tremor that started in his chest and radiated outward to his fingertips. He was drowning in a room full of air, unable to comprehend a universe where I looked at him and felt absolutely nothing at all. In my past life, I would have fallen to my knees to wipe those tears away. I would have sacrificed my own dignity to soothe his pain. I would have allowed him to drag me back to the golden cage of his castle, just to feel the warmth of his hand against mine. But the woman who loved him had died on the cold marble floor of the High Council chamber, choking on her own blood while he held the hand of a strong-smelling beta. I looked away from his weeping eyes. I turned my attention back to the shivering butcher, who was still cowering behind his wooden stall, terrified by the monstrous aura of the ruined king. I reached into my small leather pouch and pulled out 3 copper coins, setting them gently on the frozen wood. Keep the change. It is far too cold to be standing out here today. I turned my back entirely, completely dismissing the most powerful alpha on the continent. I began to walk away, heading toward the vendor selling winter apples, completely ignoring the broken man standing paralyzed in the blinding snow behind me. The crunch of my boots was the only sound, separating us until a horrifying wet crack suddenly echoed through the silent square. The horrifying wet crack that echoed through the silent square sounded like a thick oak branch, snapping under the immense pressure of a winter avalanche. It was a visceral, sickening noise that vibrated through the frozen ground and traveled up through the soles of my leather boots. I knew immediately what that sound was. It was not the breaking of ice or the snapping of wood. It was the physical, biological manifestation of a severed mate bond finally caving in on itself. When an alpha is rejected by his fated mate, the psychological trauma is immense, but when that rejection is delivered with absolute freezing apathy, the mind cannot process the grief, and the shock is transferred directly to the physical body. Torin's chest had literally fractured. I did not stop walking. I did not turn my head to verify his agony. I simply continued my steady, measured pace toward the small wooden stall where an elderly woman was selling winter apples. The heavy crunch of my boots in the snow was the only rhythm I cared to follow. Behind me, the silence of the market shattered into a chorus of terrified gasps and low, panicked murmurs from the villagers. I could hear the heavy, muffled thud of a massive body hitting the packed ice. Torin had fallen to his knees. The aggressive, suffocating stench of his rancid cedar scent spiked violently, filling the freezing air with the sharp metallic tang of raw copper and burnt ash. He was gasping desperately, pulling in ragged, shallow breaths that sounded like dry leaves scraping against stone. The physical pain radiating from him was so intense that the surrounding villagers physically recoiled, clutching their cloaks and backing away into the shadows of their stalls. A powerful alpha king was dying in the dirt, and not a single soul dared to approach him. I reached the apple vendor. The elderly woman was trembling so violently that the small wooden crates on her table rattled against each other. Her wide, terrified eyes were fixed on the agonizing spectacle behind me, but I smoothly stepped into her line of sight, blocking her view. I offered her a polite, calm nod. The stark contrast between my absolute serenity and the chaotic, violent breakdown of the man bleeding out in the snow behind me seemed to terrify her even more. I reached into the wooden crate and picked up a large, dark red apple. The skin was cold and perfectly smooth. I turned it over in my gloved hands, inspecting it for bruises with the meticulous care of a woman who had nothing else in the entire world to worry about. Please. The word tore out of Torin's throat. It was a wet, gurgling sound heavy with blood and unimaginable despair. I could hear his heavy leather gloves scraping desperately against the packed ice as he tried to drag his massive upper body forward. His lungs were failing him. The mate bond, which was designed to be a continuous cycle of shared energy and emotional stability, was acting like a gaping black hole in his chest, siphoning his life force directly into the freezing wind. He was suffocating on my absence. I selected 5 perfect apples and placed them carefully into my leather satchel, right next to the cuts of venison. I reached into my pouch and withdrew 2 silver coins, laying them gently on the vendor's table. She stared at the coins as if they were made of fire, entirely paralyzed by the monstrous display of grief unfolding in her village. I gave her a small, reassuring smile that did not quite reach my eyes. "Keep the change. The winter will be long." I adjusted the heavy strap of my satchel over my shoulder and finally turned around to face the path that led back to my isolated cottage. Torin was a pathetic ruin of a king. He was collapsed on his side in the dirty snow, his massive hands clutching the center of his chest, as if trying to hold his ribcage together by sheer force of will. Dark blood dripped slowly from his lips, staining the pristine white snow beneath his chin. His golden eyes, once arrogant and commanding, were completely, entirely hollowed out by pain. They tracked my movements with a desperate, starving intensity. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for the soft, fragile Omega he remembered to rush forward and fall to her knees to cradle his head and beg the goddess to heal his fractured soul. I looked down at him. My expression remained a mask of flawless, impenetrable ice. I felt absolutely nothing. The agonizing week of bathing in liquid Wolfsbane had eradicated every last trace of my former weakness. I was immune to his pain, just as I was immune to the toxic fog of the weeping basin. His suffering did not belong to me. I stepped around his twitching legs, giving him a wide, polite berth, as if he were nothing more than an inconvenient log blocking the village path. I did not speak a single word. I did not offer a final goodbye. I simply walked away. The snow began to fall heavier, now thick white flakes drifting down from the gray sky, slowly burying the market in a fresh blanket of silence. I walked past the terrified villagers, past the stone well, and headed toward the dark, creeping treeline that guarded my sanctuary. The sound of his wet, ragged breathing slowly faded into the howling wind, replaced by the comforting crunch of my own footsteps. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace settle over my shoulders. The past was finally dead. But as I reached the edge of the dense woods, a soft, dragging sound echoed through the trees. I paused, my hand resting on the rough bark of a pine tree. I listened closely beneath the roaring of the wind. It was the distinct sound of heavy leather boots dragging across the ice, followed by a desperate, weak gasp for air. He was not staying in the square to die. He was crawling through the blizzard, following the empty, scentless path of my footprints, refusing to let the ghost slip away into the dark. I locked the heavy wooden door of my stone cottage and slid the iron bolt into place. The fire in the hearth was already dying down to glowing embers. I methodically added 2 thick logs, watching the flames lick up the dry bark. The warmth spread through the small room, a stark contrast to the freezing blizzard raging outside. I did not look out the window. I did not need to see him to know he was there. The faint, pathetic scraping of his heavy boots against my stone porch told me everything. Torin had dragged himself through the blinding snow, following the empty path to my door. He did not knock. He did not demand entry. The arrogant Alpha King, who once commanded armies with a single roar, was reduced to a silent, trembling shadow huddled against my exterior wall. Hours passed. The blizzard intensified, howling against the roof tiles like a chorus of dying animals. I sat in my rocking chair, mending a tear in my winter cloak, perfectly content in the quiet warmth. Occasionally a violent shudder from outside would vibrate through the thick wooden door. He was freezing, his massive body already weakened by the shattered mate bond, and his starvation was failing him in the sub-zero temperatures. I threaded my needle again, my hands completely steady. When the pale gray light of morning finally broke through the frost-covered windows, the wind had died down to a low whistle. I opened the door to clear the snow from my porch. Torin was still there. He was slumped against the stone wall, his dark, overgrown hair completely white with frost. His lips were a dangerous shade of blue. When he heard the hinges creak, his hollow golden eyes snapped open. He did not speak. He scrambled to his feet, his limbs stiff and uncoordinated, instantly adopting a posture of total submission. He kept his chin tucked, his broad shoulders hunched, making himself as small and unthreatening as physically possible. I ignored him. I picked up my iron shovel and began to clear the steps. Before I could finish the first scoop, a large, trembling hand gently took the wooden handle from my grip. His touch was painstakingly careful, ensuring his skin did not accidentally graze mine. I let go. I stepped back, wrapping my arms around myself in the biting cold. Torin gripped the shovel with blue frozen fingers. He began to clear the snow, his movements sluggish but determined. He did not look at me. His gaze remained firmly fixed on the ice beneath his boots. His rancid scent of burnt ash and panic was muted by the extreme cold, but the sheer desperation rolling off his massive frame was suffocating. He was a king performing the labor of a peasant silently begging for a reason to exist in my proximity. I watched him finish the stairs. When he was done, he moved to the side of the cottage where my firewood was stacked. The heavy iron splitting axe leaned against the chopping block. He dropped the shovel and picked up the axe. His chest heaved with every breath, a wet rattling sound that indicated deep congestion. He raised the heavy axe and brought it down, splitting a thick log in two. Then another, and another. He chopped wood for 3 hours. He did not stop to rest. He did not ask for water. He simply swung the heavy iron blade, his muscles straining under the ripped, filthy leather of his royal tunic. He was systematically destroying his own remaining strength to provide me with warmth he was not allowed to share. I stepped out onto the porch again, holding a small woven basket to collect the kindling. I walked to the chopping block. Torin instantly froze. He lowered the axe, stepping back several paces to give me a wide berth. His chest rose and fell rapidly. As I reached down to gather the splintered wood, I intentionally removed my heavy gloves to better grip the rough bark. The freezing air immediately bit into my bare skin, turning my knuckles a pale, icy pink. A sharp, choked gasp escaped Torin's throat. I paused, glancing up. His golden eyes were fixed entirely on my bare hands. The sight of my skin exposed to the freezing cold seemed to trigger a visceral panic within him. He took a sudden, jerky step forward, his hands twitching at his sides as if fighting the overwhelming instinct to grab my hands and press them to his mouth to warm them. He stopped himself just as quickly, his jaw clenching so hard I could hear his teeth grinding together. He looked at my cold hands, then up to my face, his eyes pleading, begging me to put my gloves back on. He was obsessing over a minor physical discomfort, entirely unable to vocalize the catastrophic soul-crushing apology he owed me. He was terrified to speak, terrified that the wrong word would cause me to turn to ash and blow away. I calmly gathered the kindling, my bare hands stinging. I did not put my gloves back on. I did not offer him a word of thanks. I stood up holding the basket and walked back to the cottage door. I stepped inside and firmly shut the heavy oak door in his face, sliding the iron bolt back into place. The loud clack of the lock echoed in the quiet morning. Outside, the rhythmic, exhausted thud of the axe against wood resumed. The king of the southern territories would freeze to death on my porch before he ever raised his voice to me again. The afternoon sky turned the color of bruised iron as the blizzard finally broke, leaving behind a suffocating, freezing stillness. The thick snow blanketed Oakhaven in absolute silence, a silence I had cherished for 6 months. Yet the presence of the ruined Alpha King on my front porch hung in the air like a physical weight. I sat by the hearth reading a worn, leather-bound book, forcefully ignoring the faint rhythmic sound of his ragged breathing seeping through the gaps in the heavy oak door. He had finished chopping the wood hours ago. He had not knocked. He had not asked for a single scrap of food or a drop of water. He simply sat on the icy stone, a massive freezing sentinel guarding a woman who felt nothing but cold apathy toward his very existence. As the sun dipped below the jagged mountain peaks, casting long skeletal shadows across the white landscape, the absolute quiet of the woods was violently disturbed. I did not need to possess the heightened senses of a wolf to hear the heavy, uncoordinated crunch of multiple boots dragging through the deep snow. A group of scavengers, rogues driven entirely mad by the freezing starvation of the deep winter. They were moving deliberately toward the isolated edge of the village, drawn to the smoke rising steadily from my stone chimney. I closed my book, the soft thud of the parchment echoing in the warm room. I walked to the frosted glass of the small front window and wiped away a circle of condensation with my thumb. 4 massive feral men emerged from the dark treeline. Their clothes were ragged, their eyes wild and desperate, their hands gripping crude, rusted iron weapons. They were entirely focused on my front door, expecting an incredibly easy target. An isolated cottage. A lonely, scentless woman. They anticipated a quick, brutal raid for food and warmth. They did not anticipate the shattered monster waiting in the shadows of my porch. Torin rose slowly from the icy stone. His massive frame unfolded, standing directly between the approaching rogues and my wooden door. I watched his broad back tighten, the ruined leather of his royal tunic stretching over his rigid muscles. In our past life, he would have unleashed a deafening, earth-shattering roar. He would have released an alpha aura so terrifying and dominant it would have crushed their lungs and forced them into immediate whining submission on the freezing ground. He did none of those things. He kept his complete silence. He kept his dominant aura entirely contained, burying it deep within his fractured chest. I knew exactly why. He was absolutely terrified that a sudden display of alpha aggression would trigger the horrific memories of my past, terrified that acting like a commanding monster would permanently seal the freezing walls I had built around myself. He chose to fight them as a broken man, not as a king. The largest rogue snarled, lunging forward with a rusted iron blade. Torin did not shift into his massive wolf form. He simply stepped forward into the freezing snow, meeting the violent assault with his bare frostbitten hands. The clash was brutally quiet. Torin absorbed a heavy blow to his ribs, a sickening thud echoing through the crisp air, but he did not fall. He grabbed the attacker by the throat and hurled him effortlessly into a deep snowbank. The other three swarmed him immediately. I watched as cold steel flashed in the dying light. A blade sliced violently across Torin's forearm, tearing through the leather and biting deep into his flesh. Another rogue smashed the heavy wooden handle of an axe against Torin's shoulder. He took the severe punishment in complete, unnatural silence. He absorbed the agonizing physical pain simply to ensure that the noise of the battle would not disturb the quiet warmth of my sanctuary. He was systematically dismantling the desperate men, breaking their bones and tossing them back into the creeping woods, but he was doing it while taking severe, unnecessary damage. He was bleeding for my peace. He was paying for his past arrogant sins in blood on the freezing snow. Within minutes, the brutal skirmish was entirely over. The rogues dragged their broken, bleeding bodies back into the dark treeline, absolutely terrified by the silent nightmare who guarded the stone cottage. Torin stood alone in the trampled, blood-stained snow. His breathing was incredibly heavy, a wet, rattling sound that carried over the freezing wind. Bright crimson blood dripped steadily from his lacerated arm, melting small dark holes in the pristine white snow. He turned his head slightly, his hollow golden eyes catching the dim, fading light of the setting sun. He looked at the heavy oak door. He did not walk toward it to claim his violent victory. He did not pound his massive fist against the wood to demand medical attention or praise for his sacrifice. He simply dragged his exhausted, bleeding body back to the icy stone of the porch. He sat down heavily, leaning his back against the rough exterior wall, completely exposing his bleeding wounds to the sub-zero temperature. He closed his eyes, his ruined cedar sent rolling into the bitter air, waiting for the frost to numb the agonizing pain of the deep cut. He was willing to bleed to death on my doorstep in perfect silence, just to prove he would never demand anything from me ever again. I stood by the frosted window, watching the crimson puddle slowly expanding beneath his heavy boots. The cold apathy in my chest remained perfect and unbroken, yet I found my hand lingering on the iron latch of the door. The iron latch of the heavy oak door felt like a block of solid ice beneath my palm. I stood in the warm entryway of my cottage, listening to the shallow, wet rattling of Torin's breathing echoing from the wooden porch. The crimson puddle beneath the frosted window was expanding steadily, staining the pristine white snow with the undeniable proof of his silent sacrifice. The sharp metallic tang of raw copper seeped through the cracks in the door frame, mingling with the bitter draft of the winter wind. My heart remained a fortress of perfect, immovable ice. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I did not feel an ounce of gratitude. I merely recognized a practical necessity. A rotting king's corpse on my front porch would eventually attract far more dangerous predators than the desperate, starving rogues he had just dismantled. I turned away from the heavy door and walked toward my small wooden apothecary cabinet nestled in the corner of the room. I gathered a roll of clean linen bandages, a small ceramic jar of antiseptic pine salve, and a small leather flask filled with fresh water. I moved with deliberate precision. I did not rush. I would not allow his sudden violent suffering to dictate the rhythm of my peaceful life ever again. I returned to the heavy oak door, resting my hand on the cold iron. I pulled the heavy bolt back. The rusted hinges groaned a loud, abrasive sound that violently shattered the freezing, absolute silence of the deep winter evening. The sub-zero wind whipped into the warm cottage, biting fiercely at my exposed cheek. Torin was severely slumped against the rough stone wall. The deep, jagged laceration on his forearm was bleeding sluggishly, the dark, thick blood freezing almost as quickly as it spilled onto the stone. His overgrown dark hair was completely coated in a thick layer of white frost. His golden eyes were half closed, his thick eyelashes weighed down by heavy ice crystals. The rancid, suffocating scent of burnt ash and sheer primal terror that usually radiated from him had faded into a weak, pathetic ghost of a smell. He was systematically shutting down. His massive body was finally surrendering to the extreme cold and the devastating physical trauma of the shattered mate bond. I stepped out onto the porch, my boots crunching softly against the frozen blood. I did not kneel beside him. I did not offer a comforting touch. I simply stood directly over his broken, bleeding form and dropped the roll of clean linen and the ceramic jar of pine salve squarely onto his massive, heaving chest. The soft, dull thud of the medical supplies hitting his ruined leather tunic caused him to flinch violently. His golden eyes snapped completely open, the pupils dilated wide and entirely unfocused. He looked down at the bandages resting over his heart, then slowly, agonizingly dragged his exhausted gaze up to my blank face. His cracked lips were a terrifying bruised shade of blue, violently trembling as he desperately tried to form a single coherent thought. He did not reach for the medicine. Instead, his massive frostbitten hand shot forward, his bloodied fingers weakly grasping the very bottom edge of my heavy fur cloak. The grip was impossibly fragile. It was not an alpha's arrogant demand to stay. It was a pathetic, desperate anchor to a fading reality. I looked down at his shaking, bloody hand, fully preparing to firmly order him to let go and tend to his own wounds. But before I could form the cold words, his cracked, bleeding lips parted. The marble floor was so cold. The words were a ragged, barely audible whisper scraping painfully against the freezing wind. I froze, my breath catching harshly in the back of my dry throat. I stared down at the ruined Alpha King, my mind violently struggling to process the impossible sentence he had just spoken. I should have given you my heavy royal cloak. I saw you shivering by the pillar. I saw you crying, but the High Council was watching me. I am so deeply sorry. The marble was so incredibly cold against your bare feet when you fell. A sharp, agonizing jolt of electricity shot straight up through the base of my spine. He was not talking about our current life. He was not talking about the night I left him suffocating in my bedchamber just before the mating ceremony. He was talking directly about the High Council chamber. He was talking about the exact devastating moment he had publicly rejected me and chosen to hold the hand of the strong beta female. He was talking about the past life. He remembered everything. The powerful goddess had not just spun the celestial wheel of fate backward for me to escape. She had forcefully made him carry the agonizing, heavy memories of his ultimate betrayal into this completely new timeline. He squeezed the thick hem of my cloak, his knuckles turning a stark, dead white. A single hot tear escaped his frozen lashes, cutting a clean, warm path down his dirt-streaked, frostbitten cheek. The sweet honeysuckle is completely gone. I look for the soft jasmine everywhere I go. I dig through the black dirt, but I cannot find it. I burned it all away. I let them call you a weak embarrassment, and now I am permanently choking on dead ash. Please, Vesper. Just one breath. Just let me smell the jasmine one more time before I freeze. He was completely, entirely delirious. The intense, radiating physical pain and the extreme Arctic cold had entirely stripped away his regal sanity, leaving only the raw, bleeding guilt of a monstrous, unforgivable mistake. He was desperately begging for a fragile scent that no longer existed anywhere in the biological universe. He was actively drowning in the heavy consequences of a murder he had cowardly committed in a timeline that had already been entirely erased from history. I stared into his weeping, unfocused golden eyes. The absolute freezing apathy that had perfectly shielded me for 6 long months experienced a microscopic, uncontrollable tremor. Not out of sudden forgiveness, but out of profound, terrifying shock. I had safely assumed I was the only soul carrying the heavy, bleeding burden of our past. Knowing that he was actively being tortured day and night by the exact same vivid memories shifted the entire psychological landscape of our existence. I slowly reached down and firmly pried his freezing, bloodied fingers off the edge of my cloak. I stepped backward, leaving the bandages and the salve resting on his rising chest. I did not say a single word. I turned around and walked back into the warm, safe cottage, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind me. But as the iron latch clicked into place, I looked down at my own trembling hands. The towering fortress of ice was still standing, but for the very first time I noticed a single, jagged crack running straight through the deep foundation. I stood in the center of my small cottage, staring at the heavy oak door. The chilling revelation of his shared memories hung in the air, a heavy, suffocating weight that I violently refused to shoulder. He was bleeding. He was freezing to death. If I left the Alpha King to die on my front porch, the resulting political chaos and the inevitable arrival of his elite royal guard would completely destroy the quiet, invisible life I had painstakingly built in Oakhaven. It was a matter of pure, cold logistics. I walked back to the door and pulled the iron bolt open for the 3rd time. The howling wind immediately rushed in. Torin was completely unresponsive, his massive head slumped forward against his bloody chest. I grabbed the frozen shoulder of his ruined tunic and pulled. He was incredibly heavy, dead weight dragging against the stone, but I managed to haul his massive, shivering frame over the threshold. I kicked the door shut, permanently sealing out the violent blizzard. Moved to the fire. My voice was entirely flat, completely devoid of any warmth or hospitality. Torin blinked, his golden eyes slowly adjusting to the dim, flickering light of the hearth. He looked around the small, simple room, his gaze taking in the woven rugs, the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and finally, the roaring fire. He dragged his battered body across the wooden floorboard, collapsing onto the small rug right in front of the hearth. I tossed a heavy woolen blanket onto his lap. I did not offer to dress his bleeding wound. I walked into the small kitchen area, poured boiling water over dried mint leaves, and brought a simple ceramic mug back to the fire. I set it on the floorboards near his knee, deliberately maintaining a safe, calculated physical distance. Torin stared at the steaming mug. He reached out with trembling, bloodied fingers and wrapped his hands around the warm clay. The extreme heat of the fire slowly began to melt the heavy frost from his overgrown hair. Small puddles of dirty water pooled around his heavy leather boots. As his core temperature slowly rose, something imperceptible shifted in the suffocating atmosphere of the room. The rancid, sharp metallic tang of his terror and burnt ash began to recede. Slowly, hesitantly, the rich, deep aroma of sun-warmed cedar and fresh pine began to seep back into his scent. It was the commanding, comforting scent of the king I used to deeply love. The scent of a man who suddenly believed he was entirely safe. He lifted his heavy head, turning his golden eyes toward me. The manic, hollow desperation was entirely gone, replaced by a soft, blinding vulnerability. He looked at the warm fire, then at the simple ceramic mug in his hands, and finally at me. A fragile, breathtaking smile slowly cracked his bruised lips. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated salvation. He took a slow, deep breath, his massive chest expanding as he inhaled the scentless air of my home. In his delirious, hopeful mind, my act of basic, logistical preservation was a profound declaration of absolute forgiveness. He truly believed that by allowing him across my threshold, I was inviting him back into my soul. He thought the invisible, shattered mate bond was finally beginning to knit itself back together in the quiet warmth of the room. "Thank you." The whisper was incredibly soft, filled with a reverent, devastating devotion. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the stone base of the fireplace. For the very first time in 6 agonizing months, the Alpha King let his guard completely down. He believed he had finally found his way home. Within moments, the absolute exhaustion overtook his broken body, and his ragged breathing leveled out into a deep, peaceful sleep. I stood silently in the deep shadows, watching the warm firelight dance across his relaxed features. My heart did not flutter. My pulse did not race. I simply turned away and walked toward my heavy oak table. Retrieving the small leather pouch of copper coins I kept carefully tucked inside the top drawer. The pale morning light filtered through the frosted glass of the small window, casting long gray shadows across the wooden floorboards. The fire had burned down to a pile of glowing orange embers, radiating a soft, steady heat that filled the small cottage. Torin stirred on the rug. The deep lines of exhaustion that had aged his face by a decade seemed to have smoothed out over the course of the night. He took a long, deep breath, his massive chest expanding against the heavy woolen blanket I had thrown over him. His scent filled the room once more, but it was no longer the rancid metallic stench of terror and burnt ash. It was the rich sun-warmed cedar and fresh pine of an alpha who believed he had finally come home. He opened his golden eyes, blinking slowly against the morning light. A soft, hesitant smile touched his bruised lips as he remembered where he was. He looked toward the small kitchen area fully, expecting to see me preparing a morning meal fully. Expecting to begin the long, beautiful process of rebuilding our shattered mate bond. I was standing by the heavy oak door. I was fully dressed in my thick winter travel gear. My heavy fur cloak was securely fastened at my throat, and my leather satchel was slung across my shoulder, packed tightly with the venison and winter apples I had purchased the day before. I was perfectly, completely still. Torin pushed himself up onto his elbows, the woolen blanket slipping down to pool around his waist. His golden eyes locked onto my packed bags, and his soft, hopeful smile instantly froze. The rich cedar scent in the air suddenly stuttered, hitching in the quiet room as his groggy mind struggled to process the visual information. He looked from my heavy boots to my packed satchel, and finally to my completely blank expression. I walked slowly across the room, my steps deliberate and unhurried. Torin tracked my movement, his breathing beginning to accelerate, his heart rate picking up a frantic, terrified rhythm that echoed faintly in the silent cottage. I stopped right next to the hearth, looking down at his massive frame. He did not speak. He was absolutely paralyzed by a sudden creeping dread. I reached into the deep pocket of my cloak and pulled out the small leather pouch of copper coins. I held it out, suspending it directly over his chest. I let go. The heavy pouch dropped with a dull, solid thud against his collarbone. A king should really charge more for manual labor. My voice was completely hollow. It held absolutely no malice, no anger, and no hidden layers of meaning. It was the detached, transactional tone of a woman paying a hired hand for a day's work. I did not look at his face. I did not wait to see the exact moment his fragile, beautiful delusion shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I turned my back on him. I walked straight to the heavy oak door, sliding the iron bolt back and pulling it open to the freezing morning air. The wind howled, immediately rushing past me and violently extinguishing the glowing embers in the hearth. A choked, agonizing sound tore out of Torin's throat. It was not a roar or a plea. It was the pathetic, wet sound of a man who had just been dragged to the absolute pinnacle of heaven, only to be violently shoved off the edge into a bottomless, freezing abyss. His warm cedar scent soured instantly, turning completely to rancid ash and raw terror in the span of a single heartbeat. I stepped out onto the frozen porch. I did not close the door behind me. I simply walked away into the blinding white snow, leaving him utterly alone in a cold, empty house with a handful of useless copper coins resting over his broken heart. A heavy, unnatural shadow suddenly shifted in the dark treeline ahead of me. The heavy, unnatural shadow that shifted in the dark treeline was not an animal. I froze, the blinding white snow swirling around my heavy boots as I watched a line of massive dark figures silently moving through the dense pines. They were not the desperate, starving scavengers Torin had fought the night before. This was an organized, heavily armed marching column. They moved with terrifying military precision, heading straight south toward the borders of the Alpha King's territory. I held my breath, my biological cloaking shielding my presence as the massive army passed within 50 yards of where I stood. What chilled my blood was not the sheer size of the rogue army, but the heavy iron carts they dragged behind them. Stacked high on the wooden beds were hundreds of crude glass canisters swirling with a thick, heavy gray mist. The bitter metallic scent of concentrated nightshade and wild wolfsbane spores leaked into the freezing air. It was the exact same lethal fog from the Weeping Basin. Someone had found a way to harvest the graveyard of wolves. They had weaponized the very air that paralyzed our kind, and they were marching it directly toward the weakened southern capital. I did not sound an alarm. I did not rush back to the cold cottage to warn the broken king, who was undoubtedly still weeping on my floorboards. I simply turned away, heading deeper into the neutral mountains to find a new hunting ground. It was not my kingdom. It was not my war. 3 weeks passed since the morning I dropped the copper coins onto his chest. Torin had vanished from Oakhaven shortly after I left the cottage that day, dragging his shattered pride and bleeding heart back to the southern territories. I assumed he had gone to die on his own throne. I returned to my quiet, isolated routine, entirely ignoring the growing unease in the village. But the absolute destruction of a kingdom cannot be easily ignored. The news arrived on the frantic, exhausted breath of a traveling merchant whose horse collapsed dead in the center of the village square. The southern capital had fallen. The merchant babbled incoherently, his eyes wide with sheer terror, describing a sudden, unnatural gray fog that rolled over the high castle walls just before dawn. It was a chemical massacre. The elite royal guards, the fierce alpha generals, and the strong beta warriors were completely paralyzed before they could even sound the battle horns. The toxic wolfsbane gas infiltrated the central ventilation of the castle, attacking their nervous systems and rendering the entire pack completely immobile. The rogue warlord, a massive, heavily scarred beast from the northern wastes, simply walked through the open iron gates without unsheathing a single sword. He claimed the southern throne in a matter of minutes. The merchant wept violently as he described the horrifying aftermath. The entire southern pack, thousands of innocent men, women, and children, were currently being dragged from their homes and piled into the grand courtyard, unable to move their limbs or defend themselves. And the king, the ruined, broken alpha, who had spent the last 6 months tearing his own mind apart hunting for a ghost. The merchant choked on his own spit, telling the terrified villagers that Torin had not fought back. His massive body was already so severely weakened by the fractured mate bond and his prolonged starvation that the toxic gas incapacitated him instantly. He was currently bound in heavy iron chains, kneeling on the cold marble of the central execution block. The rogue warlord intended to publicly behead the Alpha King at high noon to officially cement his violent reign and absorb the surviving paralyzed pack into his own brutal army. I stood at the edge of the crowd, listening to the merchant sob. The freezing mountain wind bit at my pale cheeks. The villagers were completely panicked, packing their meager belongings, anticipating that the rogue army would eventually march north to conquer the neutral territories. I turned my back to the chaos and walked slowly toward my stone cottage. The fortress of ice around my heart remained perfectly intact. I told myself that Torin was finally meeting the bloody end he deserved. I told myself that the southern kingdom was a place of trauma and humiliation, a place I had sworn never to return to. I began to pack my heavy leather satchel, preparing to move further up into the desolate peaks where no war could ever reach me. But as I reached for my thick fur cloak, my hand brushed against the small ceramic mug sitting empty by the cold hearth. I remembered the fragile, breathtaking smile that had cracked his bruised lips when he believed he had finally come home. I remembered the agonizing sight of the Alpha King bleeding out on my freezing porch silently, absorbing brutal physical punishment just to ensure I was not disturbed. My hands stopped moving. The absolute freezing apathy that had protected me for so long suddenly felt suffocating. I looked down at my pale skin, tracing the faint silver lines that pulsed beneath the surface. I was the only living creature on the entire continent completely immune to the toxic fog. I was the only weapon that could walk through that gray mist without taking a single breath. The journey south took less time than I anticipated. I strapped the leather satchel tight across my chest and left the cottage. The howling wind of the neutral mountains was nothing compared to the violent storm raging inside my mind. For 6 months, I had cultivated a perfect absolute apathy. I had sworn to never let the Southern Kingdom or its broken king drag me back into the painful shadows of my past life. But as I sprinted through the dense frozen pines, my legs carrying me faster than they ever had. Before I realized, I was not running to save Torin. I was running to save the thousands of innocent lives currently suffocating on the cold marble floor. I was running because I was the only weapon capable of surviving the toxic air. I reached the high borders of the Southern Territory, just as the midday sun fought its way through the heavy gray clouds. The magnificent capital city was entirely submerged in a thick, unnatural sea of bitter gray mist. The weaponized Wolfsbane fog clung to the cobblestone streets, rolling lazily over the rooftops and spilling out of the grand iron gates of the castle. Stationed along the high walls were the rogue mercenaries. They wore heavy leather masks soaked in neutralizing charcoal, laughing cruelly as they looked down at the paralyzed kingdom they had conquered without shedding a single drop of blood. I did not bother to hide in the shadows. My absolute biological cloaking rendered me completely invisible to their primal senses. I walked directly through the grand iron gates, stepping straight into the thickest part of the gray fog. The air immediately tasted of bitter almonds and rotting earth. The concentrated neurotoxin flooded my lungs with every breath I took. The faint silver lines beneath my pale skin pulsed brilliantly, recognizing the poison and neutralizing it instantly. My heart beat strong and steady. The scene inside the grand courtyard was a nightmare frozen in time. Thousands of Southern Pack members were sprawled across the cold stone, entirely paralyzed. Mothers clutched their children. Strong beta warriors lay helpless beside them, their eyes wide with sheer unadulterated terror. They were conscious, but their nervous systems were completely locked. They could do nothing but watch as the massive, heavily scarred rogue warlord paced back and forth on the raised marble execution block. Kneeling in the center of the block was Torin. Heavy iron chains bound his massive wrists and his thick neck, forcing his head down. The poison had completely ravaged his already weakened body. His overgrown dark hair hung over his face, and his breathing was so shallow it barely registered. He looked like a hollow, empty shell waiting for the final crushing blow. The massive warlord raised a crude, heavy iron broadsword above his head. He roared a victorious battle cry to his mercenaries, demanding absolute silence as he prepared to sever the head of the Southern King. Torin did not flinch. He simply closed his hollow golden eyes, accepting his brutal fate. I stepped up onto the marble execution block. My leather boots made absolutely no sound against the stone. The warlord did not sense my presence. He did not smell the non-existent jasmine or honeysuckle. He simply brought the heavy iron blade swinging down with bone-crushing force toward Torin's exposed neck. I did not use a weapon. I simply raised my bare hand and caught the flat side of the heavy broadsword mid-swing. The deafening metallic clang echoed across the silent courtyard, violently interrupting the warlord's roar of victory. The massive impact sent a shockwave down his thick arms, causing him to stumble backward in absolute shock. He stared at me, his tiny bloodshot eyes wide with terrifying confusion. A small pale woman wearing a simple winter cloak standing completely unaffected in the center of a lethal toxic cloud, holding his massive weapon back with one hand. Torin slowly opened his golden eyes. He looked at my boots, then slowly dragged his exhausted gaze up to my face. The absolute paralyzing poison ravaging his veins fought against the sudden violent surge of adrenaline crashing through his heart. "You are not a ghost," the warlord snarled, violently recovering from his initial shock. He ripped the broadsword back and lunged toward my chest. I did not step back. I moved with the terrifying fluid grace of a true apex predator, immune to all worldly constraints. I ducked beneath his heavy swing, stepping directly into his personal space. I drove my elbow sharply into the center of his chest, cracking his sternum with a sickening crunch. As he gasped for air, I grabbed the thick leather straps of his charcoal mask and violently ripped it off his face. The thick weaponized Wolfsbane fog immediately rushed into his lungs. The warlord's eyes rolled back into his head. His massive body locked up instantly, the neurotoxin paralyzing his nervous system in a matter of seconds. He collapsed onto the cold marble floor directly next to Torin's heavy boots. I turned my head slowly, looking out over the terrified rogue mercenaries stationed along the high walls. I let the heavy charcoal mask drop from my fingers. It hit the marble with a soft, dull thud. Who is next? My voice was completely hollow, ringing out perfectly clear across the silent, paralyzed courtyard. The remaining rogue soldiers stared down at the execution block in absolute, unadulterated terror. The invisible, scentless woman who breathed poison, as if it were mountain air, had just single-handedly broken their invincible siege. The heavy iron sword clattered against the cold marble, echoing like a death knell across the completely silent courtyard. The rogue mercenaries stationed along the high castle walls stared down at the execution block in absolute, paralyzing terror. They looked at the massive, heavily scarred warlord lying motionless at my feet, and then they looked at me, a pale, scentless woman standing entirely unaffected in the center of the lethal gray fog. The primitive logic of the wolf hierarchy instantly overpowered their greed. I had effortlessly dismantled their invincible leader, without shifting, without roaring, without shedding a single drop of blood. They did not attempt to fight. One by one, the heavy iron crossbows and rusted broadswords were dropped over the battlements, clattering violently against the cobblestones below. The remaining rogue soldiers turned and fled, plunging blindly into the surrounding dense forests, abandoning their short-lived conquest to escape the terrifying ghost who breathed poison. A sharp, freezing mountain wind swept down through the open iron gates, cutting through the heavy courtyard and slowly dispersing the thick, bitter clouds of weaponized Wolfsbane. The suffocating metallic stench of rotting earth and nightshade began to thin out, replaced by the crisp, clean scent of falling snow. As the lethal fog lifted, the devastating paralysis gripping the southern pack began to slowly, agonizingly recede. The thousands of men, women, and children sprawled across the freezing stone began to twitch and gasp for clean air. The surviving members of the High Council, the very same arrogant alphas who had sneered at my soft, floral scent in my past life, were weakly pushing themselves up onto their elbows, their collective gaze locked onto the raised execution block. They expected to see the severed head of their alpha king. Instead, they saw me standing over the fallen warlord, while Torin remained securely bound in heavy iron chains. I stepped over the warlord's motionless body and approached Torin. His golden eyes tracked my every movement, wide and shining with an overwhelming, breathtaking reverence. I did not offer him a warm smile. I reached down and picked up the heavy rusted iron key that had fallen from the warlord's leather belt. I slid the key into the massive iron padlock binding Torin's wrists and turned it. The heavy chains fell away, crashing loudly against the marble execution block. Torin slumped forward, his massive chest heaving as he dragged fresh, clean air into his severely damaged lungs. The neurotoxin had ravaged his nervous system for hours, and the severe physical toll of his shattered mate bond had left him dangerously frail. The logical action for a recently freed king would be to stand tall, to roar his survival to his traumatized pack and reclaim his dominant authority over the surviving council. Torin did not stand up. He placed his large, trembling hands flat against the freezing marble floor and slowly, painfully dragged his exhausted body backward. He gave me a wide, respectful berth, retreating to the very edge of the execution platform. Then, in front of thousands of recovering pack members, in front of the elite royal guards and the gasping, horrified High Council, the Alpha King of the Southern Territories lowered his massive shoulders and pressed his forehead entirely flush against the cold stone. It was the absolute, ultimate gesture of total primal submission, a posture reserved exclusively for conquered prisoners begging for a swift execution. A king never bowed. A king never lowered his eyes. Yet Torin was pressing himself into the dirt beneath my boots entirely willingly. The kingdom belongs to you. His voice was a ragged, broken scrape echoing clearly across the dead, silent courtyard. He did not look up. He kept his face pressed against the freezing marble, completely exposing the vulnerable back of his neck to me. I am entirely unfit to rule. I allowed my pride to blind me to the true strength of my mate. I allowed arrogance to poison my mind, and I led this pack to the absolute brink of annihilation. You are the only true protector of this realm. You are the apex. You are the sovereign. The High Council members gasped collectively, a pathetic, wet sound of absolute horror. Their magnificent, unbeatable Alpha King was publicly, systematically stripping away every single layer of his own identity. He was actively destroying the deeply ingrained archaic laws of the wolf hierarchy with every broken word that left his bleeding lips. My life is entirely forfeit to your judgment, Vesper. Do with me exactly as you see fit. Banish me to the freezing wastes. Lock me in the deepest cells beneath this castle. Or take my life here on this execution block. I surrender the crown. I surrender the territory. I surrender my soul to the ashes. His rich cedar scent, completely devoid of the rancid terror that had plagued him for months, bloomed softly into the crisp winter air. It carried no demands. It carried no manipulative hope for forgiveness. It was the scent of absolute pure surrender. He was offering me the exact same public power he had cowardly denied me in our past life. He was giving me the blade to strike him down without hesitation. I looked down at the ruined, submitting man at my feet. The fortress of ice around my heart, which had stood perfectly impenetrable for half a year, felt a sudden profound shift. The agonizing ghosts of my past, the sneering council, the cold marble floor, the sharp-smelling beta. Female, they all began to dissolve into the howling winter wind. I had won. The ultimate victory was lying entirely defenseless before me, waiting for the fatal blow. But as I slowly reached down toward the heavy iron broadsword resting near his knees, a sudden blinding realization violently seized my mind. The heavy iron broadsword remained untouched on the freezing marble. I did not pick it up. I did not strike down the broken king who was offering his life to the ashes. Striking him down would have been an act of vengeance, and vengeance was an emotion born from lingering pain. I felt no pain. I felt only the profound, heavy responsibility of thousands of terrified eyes looking up at me from the courtyard floor. They were waiting for a sovereign to guide them out of the toxic fog. I stepped off the execution block, leaving Torin kneeling in the thawing snow. I walked directly through the parted crowds of recovering pack members, my silent footsteps echoing toward the grand doors of the castle. I walked into the High Council chamber, the very room where my soul had been shattered in a timeline that felt like a distant nightmare. The obsidian throne loomed in the shadows, cold and imposing. I climbed the dais. I sat down. The dark stone was freezing against my skin, but I did not shiver. I was the ice. The transition of absolute power was completely bloodless. Torin followed me into the hall an hour later. He did not approach the dais. He stopped at the very base of the steps, sinking to one knee, bowing his head completely, exposing his neck to the room. He remained in that exact position as the surviving council members filed in, dragging their weakened bodies to witness the unnatural shift in the hierarchy. An Omegan queen ruling without an alpha king by her side was a direct violation of every ancient biological law. A few of the older alpha councilmen exchanged nervous, aggressive glances, their pheromones spiking with sudden indignation. Before a single word of protest could leave their throats, Torin shifted his weight. He did not roar. He simply turned his head, his golden eyes locking onto the elder alphas with a terrifying, silent promise of absolute violence. He was no longer the king, but he was entirely willing to become the queen's monster. The councilmen swallowed their protests, dropping their gazes to the floor. The brutal winter slowly bled into a hesitant wet spring. The thick snow melting off the high castle walls mirrored the excruciatingly slow thaw happening within the stone corridors. I ruled the southern territories with a cold, pragmatic efficiency. I dismantled the archaic laws that punished the weak, elevating betas and omegas to positions of genuine authority. I fortified our borders, using my biological immunity to harvest the weaponized Wolfsbane, creating an impenetrable defensive perimeter that no rogue army would ever dare cross again. Through it all, Torin remained a silent, massive shadow at my periphery. He became my ultimate subordinate, my most ruthless general, and my quietest servant. He never once assumed a position of equality. When we walked through the grand halls, he deliberately remained exactly 3 paces behind my right shoulder. When the council convened, he stood silently by the heavy oak doors, his arms crossed, his rich, warm cedar scent flooding the room with a protective, stabilizing aura that kept the aggressive alphas entirely docile. He never asked for my scent. He never initiated physical contact. His subtextual groveling evolved into a masterclass of profound, agonizing patience. He learned the exact temperature I preferred my evening tea, leaving the ceramic cup on the edge of my desk before quietly retreating into the shadows. He anticipated my political strategies, executing my orders with a ruthless precision that required absolutely no verbal communication. He was slowly, painstakingly proving that his respect for my mind and my authority completely eclipsed the primal biological drive to simply claim a mate. Late one evening in the 5th month of my reign, the heavy rain lashed against the tall glass windows of the royal study. I was hunched over a massive map of the Eastern Territories, my eyes aching from the dim candlelight. The soft click of the heavy oak door shutting signaled Torin's arrival. He stepped into the room, bringing with him the fresh scent of rainwater and wet pine. He carried a stack of border reports, setting them gently on the far corner of my massive desk. He did not turn to leave immediately. He lingered, his large hands resting carefully on the polished wood, his knuckles turning white as he fought the overwhelming urge to close the distance between us. I could hear the heavy rhythmic thud of his heartbeat in the quiet room. The invisible severed tether in my chest gave a sudden violent twitch. I looked up from the map. His overgrown dark hair was pushed back from his face, revealing the exhausted, devoted lines around his golden eyes. For the very first time in almost a year, I did not look at him with complete, freezing apathy. I saw the genuine rebuilt man standing beneath the ruins of the arrogant king. Torin. His name fell from my lips, a quiet, soft sound that shattered the heavy silence. His entire massive body jerked as if struck by lightning, his pupils dilating violently as his heart rate spiked into a terrifying, erratic rhythm. He took a single desperate, stuttering step forward, the air between us suddenly thickening with an unbearable, electrifying tension. The heavy oak doors of my bedchamber remained wide open. The midnight rain lashed against the stone walls outside, echoing the exact rhythm of the night I had walked away. I stood by the open window, letting the freezing mist settle on my pale skin. Torin stood perfectly still at the threshold. The visual parallel was a heavy, undeniable weight in the quiet room. Months ago, he had crossed this exact boundary to destroy my soul. Tonight, he stood on the edge of the Persian rug, a completely rebuilt man waiting for a single, microscopic sign of permission to enter the space he had once violated. I turned my head away from the window. The cold drafts swept through the room, carrying the faint, bitter trace of burnt ash from my skin. Torin did not flinch. He did not desperately flare his nostrils, searching for the ghost of the sweet jasmine he had mourned for nearly a year. He simply looked at me. His golden eyes were soft pools of liquid devotion, completely empty of the arrogant entitlement that used to define him. I offered a single slow nod. He stepped over the threshold. His heavy boots made no sound against the thick rug. He moved with the careful, measured grace of a massive predator approaching a deeply revered deity. His rich, sun-warmed cedar scent rolled into the room, but he kept it tightly controlled, ensuring it did not suffocate my space. He stopped mere inches from where I stood. The sheer physical heat radiating from his broad chest fought against the freezing rain drifting in through the window. He raised his large, scarred hand. His knuckles still bore the faint silver lines where the rogue weapons had torn his flesh on my freezing porch in Oakhaven. His fingers hovered in the empty air beside my face, trembling with an agonizing restraint. He was terrified that if he closed the final fraction of an inch, the fragile peace we had built would shatter. I did not pull away. I did not raise the freezing walls of apathy. I took a slow, deliberate breath and leaned my cheek into his heavy palm. A violent shudder ripped through his massive frame. A choked, wet sound escaped his throat as his skin finally made contact with mine. He did not close his eyes to imagine the soft, fragile omega of his past. He kept his golden eyes wide open, looking directly at the hardened, pale face of the sovereign who had conquered his kingdom. He traced the faint silver veins of toxic immunity pulsing beneath my jawline. His touch was a desperate, sweeping worship of the very poison and ash that had turned me into a weapon. "You are the most terrifyingly beautiful thing this world has ever seen." His voice was a raw, devastating whisper that brushed against the shell of my ear. He slid his other hand around the back of my neck, tangling his thick fingers into my hair. He pulled me forward, his movements achingly slow, completely offering me the absolute power to stop him at any moment. I closed the distance, resting my forehead against the center of his chest. The moment my skin pressed against his heart, the heavy, dead void inside my chest violently contracted. The celestial tether, the sacred mate bond that had been violently severed and left to rot on the floor of the High Council chamber, suddenly sparked. It was not a painful, terrifying explosion. It was a slow, blinding warmth that started at the base of my spine and flooded upward rapidly, melting the towering fortress of ice I had lived inside for a year. The ice cracked, shivering into 1,000 pieces and melting into a river of profound relief. I gasped, my fingers curling into the thick fabric of his dark tunic as the profound, overwhelming rush of shared emotional energy crashed over my mind. I could feel his mind. I could feel the deep, bleeding ocean of his regret, the agonizing months of his starvation, and the pure, unadulterated awe he held for my absolute survival. I felt the exact moment his terror finally evaporated, entirely replaced by a stabilizing, fierce devotion. He was completely bare to me, hiding absolutely nothing, holding nothing back from my judgment. In return, I let him feel the steady, unbreakable rhythm of my spirit. I let him feel the overwhelming power of the toxic immunity flowing through my veins, proving to his shattered wolf that I would never be broken or discarded ever again. I wrapped my arms around his waist, holding his massive, trembling body against mine. Torin buried his face in the crook of my neck, breathing in the scent of cold rain and burnt ash, as if it were the sweetest oxygen in the universe. He wept silently, his hot tears soaking into the collar of my shirt, washing away the lingering bitter dust of our tragic history. We stood entirely entangled in the dark room, two completely rebuilt souls anchored to each other in the exact space where we had once fallen apart. The Alpha King had finally found his equal, and the scentless Queen had finally allowed her heart to beat again. 5 years have passed since the thick gray fog of weaponized Wolfsbane cleared from the southern capital. The heavy stone walls of the castle no longer feel like a towering prison built to enforce archaic hierarchies. They are the foundations of a completely new era. I stand on the high sweeping balcony, overlooking the grand courtyard, breathing in the crisp mountain air. The bitter scent of nightshade and burnt ash is entirely gone from this place, replaced by the sweet, blooming fragrance of wild mountain jasmine that I had painstakingly planted along the garden pathways. It is not my natural scent, but it is a beautiful reminder of the softness I was finally allowed to reclaim. The courtyard below is not filled with terrified pack members kneeling in absolute submission. It is alive with the chaotic, joyful sounds of a thriving egalitarian society. In the center of the stone square where the execution block once stood, a massive marble fountain now flows with crystal clear water. Around it, beta scholars argue peacefully with alpha generals over agricultural trade route. Omegas who once walked with their heads bowed in fear now wear the heavy silver chains of high council members, their voices echoing with unquestioned authority. I had shattered the old laws into dust, and from that dust we built a kingdom where true strength is measured by compassion rather than the sharpness of claws. A sudden warm weight settles over my shoulders. A heavy fur cloak is draped carefully around me, smelling of rich sun-warmed cedar and fresh pine. I do not flinch. I lean back into the massive solid chest of the man standing behind me. Torin wraps his strong arms around my waist, resting his chin softly against the top of my head. He is no longer the ruined, broken shadow who bled on my freezing porch, and he is no longer the arrogant king who sneered at my existence. He is my sovereign partner. He leads the royal guard, protecting the borders with a fierce, calculated loyalty that demands respect rather than fear. Our mate bond pulses in my chest, a steady, brilliant river of shared warmth and absolute trust. Look at them. His voice is a deep, comforting rumble that vibrates against my spine. He nods toward the eastern edge of the gardens. I follow his gaze, and a soft, genuine smile touches my lips. 2 young children are running frantically through the tall green grass, chasing a massive, gentle hound. The older boy has a shock of unruly dark hair and his father's bright golden eyes, but he possesses none of the aggressive primal dominance that used to curse the royal bloodline. He stumbles over a hidden tree root, tumbling into the dirt with a loud peal of laughter. Running closely behind him is his younger sister. Her pale skin glows in the afternoon sunlight. As she stops to help her brother up, I can see the very faint, beautiful silver lines pulsing gently beneath the surface of her wrist. The biological cloaking and the toxic immunity I forged in a bathtub of liquid fire had been passed down. She will never be hunted. She will never be forced to burn herself away to survive in a cruel world. She is born completely untouchable. Torin turns me gently in his arms. He looks down into my eyes, the afternoon sun catching the silver threads that have begun to weave through his dark hair. He raises his hand, brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His touch is always so incredibly deliberate, always a quiet, ongoing apology, and a profound daily promise. You saved us, Vesper. You saved every single one of us. I look out over the sprawling, magnificent kingdom, my heart beating with a powerful, steady rhythm. I am no longer a scentless ghost haunting the frozen neutral mountains. I am the sovereign queen of the southern territories, a woman forged in poison, an ash who learned how to breathe life back into a dying world. I rest my hand flat against Torin's chest, feeling the strong, even thud of his heart beneath my palm. The winter is permanently over, and the long, beautiful spring has finally begun. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.